Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. Today, a busy agenda again, and we want to start off by talking about the US economy. There's a saying, of course, so goes the US, so goes the world, and if the US sneezes, the world catches a bit of a cold, and that, of course, is reflective in Ireland. So we want to start off this week's conversation looking at the US economy, breaking it down into some key elements and some key numbers, and to see how do Americans think of this, what are the key things to look at, but also crucially, Americans often vote by the economy and vote by numbers. So I think it'll be pretty interesting to look at that and to see how that will affect voting intentions in the US. There's also been a new report from the ESRI in Ireland, which is looking at housing. And it's saying that there'll be a need for 53,000 new dwellings needed annually based on current population growth projections, and that there's been some commentary on this as if it's enough, and if this number is ambitious enough as well. So lots to get into today. And again, if you do like this podcast, please like, share, and follow across all podcast platforms. We're also available on YouTube now as well, as you can see us. So again, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We really appreciate your support. David, we're filming this on Thursday morning, and I have just come back from my local polling station in central London, where I casted my first ballot in a UK general election. And it's a bit of a foregone conclusion, so we won't really be talking much about the UK election today. Next week, we'll be hoping to kind of dive into that with all the results finished, and also focusing on the French elections as well.
Yeah. Dale, that's a bit different to Ireland, isn't it? Because I know that the local elections there, persons living in the country can vote, but European elections restricted to EU citizens, and then general elections restricted, I believe, to citizens. So that is a bit different how we do it in Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the benefits, I suppose, of the common travel agreement between Ireland and the UK is that Irish citizens get the right to vote in UK in all UK elections, and that right is also conferred back to them. One fact I did actually find out recently was Irish people in the UK have always had the right to live, work, get all social benefits, vote in the election. We also have the right to stand in their elections as well, in their general elections. However, that right is not actually conferred back to UK citizens in Ireland, so they can live, work, get all social benefits. They can vote, but they actually can't stand. You need to be.
You're eyeing up a 29 run. Is that it for the next general?
That's
the
next
plan. Term.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going the long run. That's
Very
the plan.
Good.
So
have you picked your constituency yet?
Let's see how the results come out this evening and tomorrow, and we might try find somewhere that's a bit more safer for me. So let's see.
I say that because it's really common, isn't it, in the UK, for people to have a constituency that really isn't where they've grown up and historically lived. Like, people can get plopped into certain constituencies based on the party deciding it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, you have this thing called a safe seat, which is, an area in the country that's traditionally just such a stronghold where, actually you wouldn't even need to really campaign. You could rarely be seen, and that would be enough actually to win an election. So now, but I think if you look at Ireland, there really is no such thing as a safe seat. We have multi-seat constituencies. So oftentimes when, candidates are campaigning, they're not just campaigning against their political rivals and other parties. They're often campaigning, and sometimes their biggest competition is going to be someone actually in their party who's their, inverted commas, running mate, which kind of keeps them on their toes, which I think is actually probably a healthy thing for democracy and keeps them tied to the constituency and always campaigning.
Yeah, you have to do the local work. That's just such a feature of our system vis-a-vis over in the UK. Yeah,
You do. You do. And
yeah,
then speaking of which, I mean, I think if we look across the pond to the US, we wanted to start off this week, David, talking about the US economy.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
So I give a bit of background to this. In my days, chief economist at Carrickhill, we were always trying to follow a mix of global patterns to try and look in at how the global economy is doing because it heavily influences Europe. Our kind of mission was always to figure out what's happening in Europe, how European stocks might trade. But looking at the US economy is so crucial, as you mentioned, that idea of US sneezing and the world catching a cold. Ireland in particular is heavily exposed to how the US gets on. So I thought I'd go through a couple of data points that are things that I would commonly follow while thinking about the US economy and how they can relate back to Ireland, and then just why they are kind of market relevant and relevant for an economy. And we could also talk about where the US is today, because the US has been on quite a strong run in recent times. So, like the
on
rest of the
fire.
world, yeah, like the rest of the world, it went into recession when COVID came along, but it has very much returned to trend growth. So. The trend in the US has been kind of 2% year on year annual GDP, and the most recent Q1 number came in at 2.9, so closer to 3% than to 2. So there's this rhythm in the US economy that has continued to be quite strong. But what you have then are some other challenging areas in the US. I'd look at things like the federal debt level and the budget. So Ireland was lucky after our crash to be able to get our budget balanced and to get our debt levels down. But the US hasn't done that. And there is this phenomenon in the US because they issue the main reserve currency, the dollar, that they effectively have this thing called exorbitant privilege, whereby in other countries, if you have wide deficits and high debt, the market is going to come along and enforce a high interest rate to make sure that you actually get your house in order.
And
But in
just
the
to bring
US,
that, just to bring that back, that point back, just to more recent times, the Irish, of all people, will recall that, given that back at the start of the last decade, interest rates on Irish government debt. So again, when there was a deficit, they needed to borrow money off the markets to fund the country. Those interest rates increased significantly to the point where it wasn't really sustainable because they were priced out of the market because funders didn't believe that the Irish could actually pay back that debt because of the deficit. But the US has that privilege, you were saying.
yeah. So the idea of default risk in the US just very rarely, if ever, rears its head, and the reason being that there's just never a belief that the US wouldn't pay its debts back, because there's this idea that if the US defaults on its debt, then the whole world economy kind of comes crashing down. Then you can't trust any other country to repay their debts. But the
That's not
US
good.
is it's not. But the US is at quite elevated levels. So its debt to GDP is now 99% of GDP, which is really near what we call the danger zone. So anything above 100% of GDP gets you in a range that Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Italy, all these crisis countries from 10 years ago were in. And some of the projections out to the next decade, if you go to 2034, are anywhere between 122% of GDP and 134% of GDP. So there's quite eye-watering debt levels that are to come in the US. And it's all because their deficit is now running somewhere above 6% of GDP, which is incredibly wide deficit to have. And I rarely hear anyone talking about that in even the day-to-day analysis that I'm doing in the economic world. Very few people come along and say, "Oh gosh, the U.S. deficit is 6% of GDP." It's
Yeah,
one of these things that,
it's always the debt ceiling and that constant battle in Washington every year where it's do they increase the debt ceiling, etc. But you're right, there is never really a question on, well, they're spending more and a lot more each year than they're taking in.
that's it. And there is this idea that something's got to give there. Does America find a politics that will agree to lower spending Probably not. Both the parties nowadays are quite spendthrift, or to raise taxes, and maybe you'd get that off the Democratic side, but you're certainly not going to get it off the Republican side. So
No.
there's this risk that really the wide deficit just continues. You kick the can down the road. That's what all the deficit ceiling raises are really about. Is actually just saying we're going to come back to this another day. And if that's the attitude of your day to day politics, it's going to eventually blow up somewhere on the economic side. Now this could be 10 years away as an issue that becomes a crunch point, but it's lingering in the background there. And I thought it was quite stark to look at these numbers again and see how high it had become.
Yeah, and is this on anyone's radar, David? Like, I know you're saying it's not really talked about, but like, is anyone talking about this? And if
Well,
not, why?
it's regularly talked about if you are investing in the bond market, for example. So U.S.
Yeah,
Treasuries, the yield on them has notched higher in the past couple of years, but a lot of that has been inflation driven. That investors now want protection for higher inflation, but there isn't within, at least that I've seen within the U.S. Treasury number, the idea of there being a risk around not non-payment of debt, whereas Ireland and Greece and other countries really hit that 10 years ago. As you mentioned, our bond yields just soared higher with a genuine perception by markets that we could go on to not pay some of our debts back. So it is very, very, very different. The next
yeah,
metric I want to talk about is just things around consumer finance. So we're talking about government debt, but then you have household debt. So maybe the story in Ireland is worth recalling, that because of the Celtic Tiger, and people borrowing for house extensions, for holidays, for homes, there was a lot of mortgage debt. We had a really high
120% mortgages. You'd mortgage your home and then get and on the mortgage you'd
get a bunch
add
of
on a
cash in
holiday as well.
as well. Yeah, I mean that kind of stuff, was sent Ireland's household debt levels really high,
Yeah,
and it meant that we had high servicing costs. But in the US, they have this metric called the household debt service ratio, and it's looking at the personal debt size. The personal debt issue, and coming into the last kind of, where were we just before the last crash in 2007? We were at 13.3%, which is where what are your debt payments as a share of your disposable income, and that was relatively elevated. But now we're down to below 10%. We're down to 9.7, and we really shot down to those low levels after the US crash, because a lot of people were basically hit foreclosure. Some people were given the
sure.
keys to their homes back, so so where some people in Ireland stuck with their properties, but had to pay, had to do like a deal with their bank to keep paying money back. Some people just gave back the keys. So it meant that your debt issue resolved itself a little sooner in the US by people just saying, look, fine, take the house, I'll move somewhere else. So that came below 10% about a decade ago, but it stayed there.
Uh,
So yeah.
and this ratio then is looking at, so it's basically the amount of money that people are repaying to their debt obligations, right?
Yeah, so what are your debt repayments to your
Yeah,
bank or your lender as a share of your disposable income? So if your incomes rise, then people are in a better position to repay their debts. And that's what appears to have happened during COVID. So when America came along and splurged a lot of cash and gave people checks, people had a lot more money, and their debt levels didn't change much at all. So that ratio that's today at around just under 10%, 9.7, it shot right down to 8, whereby people just had a load of cash and were still repaying the same amount of debt. So I think that has contributed partly to how America's economy has boomed in a good way. Coming out of this, is that people had a lot of cash but don't have a lot of debt repayments holding back their consumer spending. So we're
yeah,
in a good position now in terms of the household balance sheet, the overall household position. It means that Americans are in a good position to spend, which supports the GDP number that I mentioned at the start. And just on that, there actually is a metric on what we call excess savings. So because people were given a lot of cash, people had a lot more deposits than they had historically, and people had capacity to spend. Now, because inflation came along, that weakened people's that meant that people had to draw down on those savings. So there's a metric called excess savings, and it peaked coming out of COVID, like the year 21, 22. Peak excess savings was 2.3 trillion US dollars. But that has notched lower, and we're now at a level that's zero point 0.6. So it's come right down,
so it's nearly all
and
gone.
it's nearly all gone. but there is still some there. And there's been this whole question since inflation came along of okay, can people afford to pay the higher prices, or are people just drawing down on savings? And there's
Yeah.
this idea that once the excess savings draw down to zero, then people don't have anything else to lean on, i.e., they will then cut their spending. You'd end up in a recession, you get high employment, and the whole thing will fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen some commentary on this online as well. I think it might have been Sarah Carey who mentioned this, but don't want to misquote myself here. But the point was around people who had the COVID savings, this a bunch of cash kind of just saved up from not spending it as normal because of lockdown, etc. And people are now reaching the point where the final bit of COVID cash is being spent on their the couple of holidays this year, and then we're going to reach a point where the money is gone. So has that been an artificial support and a crutch for supporting this, pretty strong growth in the U.S. economy over the last number of years, to the point now where the cash runs out, the artificial crutch is gone, and we won't be able to pay for this?
Yeah, that's what I think the numbers here show. The question then is, okay, when might you reach that point? I still think
Yeah.
you have at least a couple of months, if not another year of this, because there's still gas in the tank, so to speak. And when you look at things like unemployment, right? So that's another metric I'm going to bring up. Unemployment is at very, very historic lows. So we're at around 4% on the unemployment rate. We have been a little lower, kind of like 3.8, 3.7. But that is an unemployment low in the US that we haven't seen. I think it's since the 1950s. The chart I have, I'm looking at, it's showing me since the 70s, and there's no point that came lower. And this goes to the post-COVID phenomenon of tight labor markets, businesses really in demand again, looking for staff, looking to hire staff, and there not being enough people around. So that was very good for wages. Wage growth in the US peaked in March 22 at 7%. So the average US worker taking on an extra 7% on their incomes. The most I think in Ireland we've done is somewhere above 4%. So it's been quite good for the typical US worker, although the inflation rate in the US was also a bit higher. And to the latest value we have in May, we're at 4.2% year on year. So that is decent wage growth. But what emerges when you look over history, 70s, 80s, 90s onwards, is that there is a pattern to this. There's a rhythm of the unemployment level going to a kind of a low point and then it notching higher. And we have notched slightly higher in recent times, but still are very, very low in the unemployment level. But we may notch higher. And if you get to the late fours into 5%, 6% unemployment, that is typically where you end up with a recession in the US. So it is something to keep an eye on. It looks like we might be moving quite slowly over the quarters towards something like that. And it could be related to that excess savings number that I mentioned. The key
And I
thing,
think
yeah.
the figures around kind of that dampening in the labor market. The question then is how will that affect interest rates as well? I know in the UK, that's a factor being considered for do they make their first interest rate cut to kind of tackle that weakening in labor. It remains to be seen, but it's a metric to watch out for.
Yeah, so interest rates went pretty high in the US. They're
Yeah.
currently standing above 5%, and there are expectations between the Fed and market expectations that they will lower, that they will come below 4% into threes and maybe settle somewhere just below three at around 2.8 in the long run. I'm doubtful as to whether well, I think you may get there eventually. So maybe there is something correct to it, but certainly for the near term, some of the near term expectations have been a bit too high. So just
Mm.
thinking about Europe, thinking about the ECB, there were expectations of four interest rate cuts this year.
Yeah.
Gabriel McLuth, the Irish Central Bank governor, said this week, "Well, look, there might be one more, and that's it." So they've done one already, one more to come, and that's it, two instead of four. So the pace of cuts, I think, is being very, very, very cautious. And part of that is driven because the economy continues to be quite strong, both in
Yeah.
Europe and in the US. And
So,
so long as that's the case, you have a slower pace of cuts.
and it's the same in the UK as well. The latest thinking or the latest reading that I've seen is around doing one cut quite soon, but then holding on that. But it's a signal. It's meant to be a signal to the market that this is the intent. We aren't there yet. We'll do one cut now, hold and see how it goes. But the intention is to be positive.
Yeah, yeah, that's about right. That's what their
Yeah.
thinking is here too. The
Okay.
the,
Great.
the Just to say about unemployment, then the one thing that is important to look at. So when you think about unemployment rising, there's a metric that turns before unemployment does, and it's a thing called job openings. So when we came out of the pandemic, job openings in the US shot up to really high levels. Historically, in a typical year, you might have 4, 6 or so million job openings at any one time. We shot up to 12 million job openings. These were in a mix of sectors, people looking to hire wait staff in restaurants, tech workers, programmers. It was a really, really hot labor market some 2 years ago. So this is in March 22. As of April this year, we're down to 8 million. So there has been a decline from peak. And if
Which is
you're
still
8 million,
high.
it's still high. It's still high. It tells you that there's still demand for jobs out there in the US. I mean, 8 million jobs is 3 or 4 times the number of total jobs that are in Ireland, at any one time. So
Yeah.
it's a remarkably large labour market, just to put it in comparison. But falling below 8, and then if you get back to your 6 or 4, that's where you have the risk of recession. But historically, going back to the 70s, you do need those job openings to probably drop below 4 and be getting even as low as 2 million for there to be a recession. That is historical pattern anyway. We may hit a recession at a slightly higher number this time, but it is something to keep an eye on as well.
And David, what about layoffs? And of course, hiring is one element, but if you flip it on layoffs, how's that looking?
Quite good. So layoffs in a typical year, kind of you go back to the pre-crash year, layoffs were kind of running
Yeah.
around 2 million in any one year, and that sounds crazy high, right? 2 million people being laid off, but it is there's a rolling thing. There's people being laid off, and then there's people being hired all the time. So your unemployment number is the net of that. In more recent pre-COVID years, layoffs were kind of running maybe like 1600, 1800. But right now we're at 1500. So we are below the historical pace of layoffs. So we would need those layoffs to hum higher into the 1800s, maybe around 2000, for there to be a recession. And when the crash came in '08, you had layoffs hit around 2.5 million, which is way higher than we are now, another million higher. And then the layoffs during COVID, I mean, it was a bit silly
Uh,
because um, everyone got laid off during COVID. So you had
I
layoffs that
I can
were,
actually I can see the chart that we're both looking at, and it actually leaves the
yeah,
it leaves the formatting on the chart.
I actually can't tell you the number, but it's somewhere above
No.
like 13.5 million. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. The labor market in the US, the other thing to mention, because this is a topic that comes up with the Irish labor market, is the additional jobs that are actually by foreign-born citizens versus native-born. And this is basically the majority of job additions in 21, 22, and 23 in America were to foreign-born citizens. And that's typically what you get in a very hot labor market. If you want to add new jobs, it's hard to actually pull people off the unemployment line because the people who wanted jobs out of there were already able to find them. You then rely on net inward migration to add to your jobs total. And that's just a similar pattern that we've seen in Ireland. I've mentioned before about work permits in Ireland. I don't think I've said this on the podcast yet because I did it in the week since. But work permits in Ireland, if you add them up since the start of 22, they're larger than the population of the city of Galway. That's how
Wow.
reliant Ireland. That's how reliant we've had to be on additional jobs from outside, not just Ireland, but outside the EU, to try and fill the jobs gap. So that's adding to healthcare, construction, tech, and a mix of sectors that have been kind of crying out for extra staff in the post-COVID years.
Okay.
Oil markets is something I should talk about as well, just because when the energy crisis came along, the spike in gas, which was the big issue in Europe, was a key driver of the spike in CPI, the spike in inflation, and the oil price in more normal years in America but widely around the world, is a key driver of inflation also. And it can also reflect kind of global supply and demand patterns. So you go back to before the '08 crash. You had a peak in the oil price of 145 US dollars per barrel. And people might be surprised to find that we actually haven't had an oil price higher than that in the kind of decade and a half since. And that might be against the common perception out there. People think that, okay, well, my gas bill has been much higher in recent years, therefore surely, and people's what people pay at the pumps has never been higher. So therefore, surely the price of oil has been higher. But at least in the US,
but I suppose the one thing that has added in some countries has been the likes of a carbon tax and that sort of thing, which probably has brought it up. I know the price, the actual market price didn't go to as high as it was back in '08, but you do have carbon levies and all, which have been added now to the high price which came post Russia invading Ukraine, which probably added more to it as well, just to make that point.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But what we've seen in more recent times is because of the energy crisis, there was a spike in oil. It spiked to like 123 dollars
Yeah.
a barrel, but it has come lower in recent times. So we're now sitting at around $81 a barrel as of June 30th, and that is an easing. It reflects an easing of the price, but probably due to extra supply coming on board. So when the price rises, it actually spurs a lot of oil producers to put a few extra barrels into the market. But you also have the US has a strategic reserve, and they can release some supply into the market, which can actually lower the price. So Biden did that, and that actually made an impact as well. So far, the oil price isn't actually at a very high level, so long as it remains in, so long as it doesn't spike like it's done in the past. It's good for inflation. It's good for the U.S. For typical Americans filling up at the gas pump, that sort of thing. And it's the sort of thing that can kind of feed the psychology of people into an election year. So the last metric I'm going to look at, Dale, is is consumer confidence. And I think it ties in with this idea of it being a metric that is quite psychological for people, particularly in a US election year. So, if the oil price is high, it can be quite bad for an incumbent. I think it's no surprise that 2008 figure that I mentioned, like the highest ever oil price, was the year where the Republicans, the incumbents, did terribly, and Barack Obama got in 2012. But what you also had that year was obviously the crash in the financial markets, which sent consumer confidence lower by a very high amount, and it sent it lower for both Democrats and Republicans. And the reason I mention consumer confidence for both sides of the political aisle is that there's typically a partisan nature to consumer confidence, which is a very surprising thing. Like if you were to ask Sinn Féin voters, let's say, or Fine Gael Fianna Fáil voters, what's the state of the Irish economy, or what's the state of the jobs market? I've never seen this before. I don't think it's ever been done, but I'd be surprised if you had a significantly large gap between the two, and that it would flip between whether one party's in government or not. But what you find in the US is that, go back to the Bush years, you always had around 50% of Republicans saying that the economic conditions are either excellent or good, but Democratic voters were down around 20%. So there's a real partisan split, and there has been for quite some time. If you go back to the Obama years, 2012, actually consumer confidence was really, really, really terrible for most of the years coming out of '08. But this gap grew between the two parties. But by the time Obama was finishing his term at the end of 16, you had Democrats rated at about 40% of them said the economy was excellent or good, and only 20% of Republicans did. But then when Trump came in, we got this kind of crazier split between the parties. There was a point during the Trump years around 2019, before COVID came along, where 80% of Republicans said that the economy is excellent or good, and Democrats were right down around 40%. But the fact that both parties rated it reasonably well spoke to how how strong the economic period was. That the middle of that Trump term was where a lot of metrics were going in the right direction. There was decent real wage growth. Unemployment was quite low. It was a decent place to be.
Inflation was low.
Yes,
Yeah.
inflation was low. Inflation was low. But come along to today, you have a situation now where only 10%, because we're in a Biden era now, right? Democrats run the White House. Only 10% of Republicans say the economic conditions are excellent or good, but 37% of Democrats do. Now, where I've always where I've what I've always believed this year coming into this U.S. election year is that this was always the Democrats to lose. It's an election for them to lose because you have unemployment at a great level. You have inflation has come down. You've got GDPs rising. You've got a whole bunch of metrics that throughout U.S. history are not at their heyday, their best, but the mix of them is very much a unique period in U.S. political history. Whether it's Biden, whether it's another candidate, if they lose to Trump, it's going to reflect terrible politics. It's going to reflect them having an economy which makes them so re-electable and them not capitalizing on it.
Hmm. I agree. I mean, I think my one pushback on that would be, under normal circumstances, that would be true. But I think, the reason I think this is going against the Democrats now is because of the questions around Biden's performance in the last debate, and questions around his age and can he and is he fit enough to do the job. So I'm not sure if they lose the White House, I'm not sure how much of an impact it'll be because of the performance of the economy versus just the situation of was he the right candidate or not. That's the one thing I would just push back a little bit on, I think, David.
Yeah, look, if Biden goes to November 4th, he'll lose it because he is perceived to not being strong enough to make it to 85, because he will be 85 years old leaving office, should he make it to the end of a second term. But if the Democrats replace him, which is now somewhat being discussed about, then I think that scenario re-arises where I think the narrative coming out of that election might be, look, we had a good Democratic candidate. We got rid of the guy whose questions about his age were holding him back, but we still lost to Trump. That will reflect, I think, really bad politics, because the convention for the Democrats is going to be towards the end of August. So you have the best part of 2 months to try and get another candidate in place, and then you have all of September and October to campaign with that new national candidate, to then go on and try and win when the November election comes along. Dale, would it be worthwhile if I talk people through where the betting odds now are essentially, or who's more likely to
Yeah.
take. Yeah, because now that, because you've other names in the mix now. So Kamala Harris, the VP, is actually now surpassed Biden as being more likely to go on to win the presidency than Biden himself. And then you've got Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg in the background, and any one of those could emerge to be the Democratic candidate. And I know Michelle Obama was another candidate that you and I have talked about as well as being potentially up there.
But then I think also the money then that's actually just placed on Trump right now is still, I mean, he's still pricing over double in terms of support, in terms of likelihood to actually win the election as well. I suppose the question here, David, for me is, is the damage done, and is this too late to save now? My thinking is, unless they put in a stellar candidate, the likes of Michelle Obama, I actually struggle to see how they can save this at this stage. And I wonder, is this a fatal wound now that's just going to slowly kill the Democratic campaign?
Yeah, you're going to need Biden to withdraw voluntarily, and he's going to need to do that
And
before.
soon.
Yes, I think that has to happen. Should he do that, then you get a much cleaner opening up to new candidates, enough time before the convention for the delegates to move their votes, and then you have enough time to adequately go to the country with a new candidate in a unified way. But if this goes to convention, Well, firstly, all the candidates have pledged for Biden. They had a primary, and Biden won the primary. So it's very hard for any new candidates to come through that primary and suddenly pip Biden to be the nominee. So you then end up with Biden going to November probably as a default. So the key question here is Biden deciding not to run or not. All of the candidacies don't take off without that. So Michelle Obama, for example, you've had Barack Obama come out really strong for Biden straight after those debates, saying, "Look, don't let one debate performance scupper his chances." Same for Bill Clinton, which tells you that Hillary was also not in the mix right now. Gavin Newsom was really really strong, really gunning for Biden in the hours after that debate, saying, "Look, one debate performance shouldn't
Of course
define
he
him."
was.
And
Of
then
course he was. Yeah.
Pete Buttigieg is in the administration as transport secretary. So the potential for any of these candidates to actually speak out against Biden or to campaign on their own candidacy just isn't there, so long as Biden is the selected nominee by the primary voters, and himself wants to keep going.
Exactly. Yeah. And look, it's going to be really interesting to see how this turns out. The other thing to point out as well is that Kamala Harris kind of needs to remain on the ticket, either as the presidential candidate or remaining as the vice president candidate, mainly because there is a $250 million raise in campaign financing. And for the Democrats to keep that campaign financing money as part of the campaign, my understanding is that she needs to remain on the campaign ticket. If she was to be removed from the ticket, they would lose $250 million in financing, which is a lot of money to lose.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Should we quickly turn, David, so look, I think the US economy, the net there is things are looking pretty good, I think, overall. It's in a pretty good state. You mentioned at the end there, the key indicators, are at their best levels ever, more or less. Some warning signs, though, trickling through, and will a recession be in the medium term in the offing? Remains to be seen. But how that trickles down into people voting and in the US election, I think, will be pretty fascinating. And it's one look we're going to keep talking about on this podcast as the weeks unfold. And there's a lot more to come here, I think. Mm-hmm. Let's turn to housing, I think, David. We have a little bit of time left. And we mentioned at the start the ESRI launched a report in the last week on housing, which shows that there is a need for between 35,000 and 53,000 new dwellings will be needed annually based on projected population growth scenarios as determined by the ESRI. So the report looked at forecasting for population levels related to housing requirements using the census and other research data points, and had various forecasts with respect to international migration patterns, which of course is a big topic right now politically, and how that will affect servicing demands and housing demands for the country over the next decade or so is going to be pretty important. So, David, the ESRI gave a bit of a range in terms of the number of dwellings needed to be built each year, ranging from 38,000 to 50,000. Question here is that enough? Because those numbers to me seem a little bit lower and not as ambitious enough as I know we've spoken about before. And there's lots of other big names who are spending a lot of time in researching this issue where those numbers don't seem to be ambitious enough.
Yeah, so immediately when this report came out, Ronan Lyons of Daft.ie fame of Trinity College came out to talk about his work on the Housing Commission, saying that they, in the Housing Commission, went and looked at average household size, which currently sits at around 2.7 people per household. And the European average is somewhere closer, lower, or the early twos, maybe 2.2 or so. And there's always this view that we don't just need to build houses to cater for additional population. We need to build more than that to basically get Johnny out of the box room, right? The kids who are kind of living with their parents for longer, people who are sharing three bed apartments but would like to live on their own. So there's extra pent up housing demand that's out there. And Ronan Lyons was quick to point out that this ESRI report didn't factor in pent-up demand. It wasn't in their remit, actually, because the report was commissioned by the Department of Local Government, whereas the Housing Commission specifically did, and they went off and did that and came up with a figure as high as 80,000 additional homes needed. But I think what's really important about the ESRI report is that it focuses heavily on migration scenarios. So in a low migration scenario, they think that the new homes needed lies somewhere between 35,000 and 47,000 homes per year. But in a high migration scenario, will be 41 to 53. And you're talking about differences around 10,000 homes based on whether you have lower high migration. Really, it's close to like 15,000 homes based on the different scenarios. I think it points to how dependent these figures are on migration. And it's very hard to know and to predict what our migration patterns might be. So having just talked about the US, when labor markets are hot, you take in a lot of extra people from abroad to fill your labor shortages. If we get to a stage where the Irish economy cools, and if the US economy cools too, then we're going to be at the lower end of these migration scenarios. I mean, we could get to a completely flat level. If you had a recession in Ireland, you're going to have unemployment. People typically leave the country. People who've come into the country typically leave, and then the need for new housing could shoot right lower. Now, I'm not trying to say for a second that the government. Yeah.
Well, I was going to make the point that it doesn't. I think that's all well and good, and that's more in a. I think that those are good figures in a steady state scenario, but we have a backlog of people needing a home right now, and I think I think that pent up demand piece, which has been called out, combined with the fact that we have people who want to live on their own and change the living circumstances that they've been used to for the last 10 years or so. That's not really addressed here, is it?
No, it isn't. And in a way, these figures don't matter because, like, the government is going to find that it keeps building higher numbers of homes, and the homes end up getting filled. So as long as you're building homes that get filled, you still need to build more of them. That's just the equation really as it stands. What I think both these debates on both sides don't capture is actually really it is about the type of housing. So you do need to be building more social affordable homes. You do need to keep going along with the schemes like the Help to Buy in the First Home scheme, which actually give people access to the housing market, be it a new home or an existing home. I mean, a lot of people, when they go out to buy their first home, typically buy an existing house, not a new one. So getting good access to the housing market is almost more important than the typical numbers that we build each year.
I had a look through the report as well, David, and one of the things which stood out to me was the commentary around. And I'm not sure if this was fully factored in, which is kind of where the home is going to be needed. And if I look at, again, if I look towards my experience, and if you take Toronto, for example, and let's say Canadian immigration, one of the big challenges that they were facing were, if you looked at where were the immigrants going when they moved to the country, they were all going to, the 1, 2, or 3 major metropolitan centres across the country. And that was then significantly impacting the local housing needs in those major cities, and development not keeping up with demand and leading to a significant housing increase. So again, the report did differentiate and look at the housing needs by geography and location within the country, but I'm not sure if it was fully factored in the level of which a concentration of immigration and migration will be on those metropolitan centres.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even if you had a more moderate level of migration, you'd still have heavy demand around Dublin, most likely, and that's where the need for more apartments and housing there. Like we've discussed this before, there is higher pace of apartment building now in Dublin, which is quite welcome. But we may need even more on that, and that's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, with that, we are out of time, I think, David, for this week. So again, thank you all for listening and for watching. If you did like this podcast, please like, share, and follow our various channels on various social media accounts. Your support means a lot to us, and we appreciate you watching and look forward to talking to you again next week. So thanks again for listening and for watching, and take care.